She'd been sleeping on his doormat for 21 nights, a small, dark comma against the worn gray fibers. But last night, she left something that made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in months. It wasn't food she wanted. He knew that now. Elias had tried, of course. In the first week, he'd left out a small bowl of milk, the way his grandmother used to for the barn cats back in the country. The bowl sat untouched, collecting a thin film of city dust and night dew. The next night, he'd tried a can of tuna, the good kind, packed in oil. He'd opened it, and the smell, pungent and familiar, had filled his small kitchen, a ghost of a scent from a time when he used to make sandwiches for two. He'd set it on the porch, a few feet from where she always settled, and watched from behind the thin glass of his back door. She'd turned her head, her luminous green eyes fixing on the offering for a long moment, and then, with an almost imperceptible shake of her head, she'd turned away. She just watched the street. She just waited. By the third week, he'd given up on trying to feed her. He'd simply accepted her presence as part of the new, silent rhythm of his life. His life was a collection of these silent rhythms now. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in a house that used to be filled with laughter. The precise click of the deadbolt at 10 p.m. every night. The weight of the empty space on the other side of his bed. And now, the soft, almost invisible breathing of a small charcoal gray cat on his doorstep. She would appear just as the streetlights flickered on, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadows of the overgrown hedge that bordered his property. She never made a sound. No meow, no cry. She would just arrive. She'd pad silently across the damp concrete of his small patio, her paws, making no noise, and she'd curl up on the bristly doormat. It was a cheap thing he'd bought years ago, the word welcome almost completely faded, but she treated it like a throne. She would tuck her nose under her tail, a perfect circle of dark fur, and her breathing would slow. But she wasn't always asleep. Sometimes, when he'd get up in the middle of the night, drawn from his bed by a silence that was too loud, he'd look through the door's glass panel and see two slivers of pale green staring back at him. Not with fear, not with expectation. Just watching. It was a vigil. He didn't know for what or for whom, but it felt like one. The city around them was never truly quiet. There was always the distant sigh of traffic on the main road, the occasional wail of a siren that rose and fell like a lament. The air, especially tonight, was thick with the smell of coming rain, that heavy electric scent of damp earth and cooling asphalt. It was a smell that always made the ache in his ribs feel a little sharper. Lena had loved that smell. She would throw open the windows, even when it was chilly, and take a deep breath, her eyes closed. "It's the world getting a drink," she'd whisper, as if sharing a secret. "Everything is thirsty." Elias felt thirsty all the time now, a deep, unquenchable thirst in his soul that no amount of water could fix. It had been 8 months since the house fell quiet. 8 months of learning to navigate the geography of grief, where familiar rooms became foreign countries filled with landmines of memory. Her reading glasses still on the nightstand, her favorite mug at the back of the cupboard, the one with the chip on the rim. He couldn't bring himself to move them. Moving them felt like an erasure. It felt like admitting she was never, ever going to come back and use them again. So he lived in a museum of a life that was no longer his, a ghost in his own home. And then, 21 nights ago, the cat had appeared. She was small and thin, but she held herself with a strange sort of dignity. Her fur was the color of a storm cloud, short and dense, with a few faint, almost invisible stripes on her flanks that you could only see when the porch light hit them just right. Her ears were a little ragged at the tips, one of them carrying a small, neat little tear, the mark of a life lived on the streets. She was a survivor. He could see it in the careful, deliberate way she moved, in the constant, subtle swivel of her ears, tracking sounds he couldn't hear. She was alert to every danger, yet she had chosen this spot, his doorstep, as her sanctuary, a place to be vulnerable, if only for the night. He'd started talking to her, through the glass. At first it felt foolish, a grown man, whispering to a stray cat through a locked door. But the silence in the house was so suffocating, and her presence was so constant. "Looks like rain tonight," he'd murmur, his breath fogging the pain. "You should probably find somewhere dry." The cat would just blink slowly, a long, deliberate blink that felt less like a reflex and more like a response. He'd read somewhere that a slow blink was a sign of trust in the feline world. A cat's way of saying, "I see you, and I am not a threat. I am safe with you." The thought was a small, warm ember in the cold cavern of his chest. Tonight, the air was different. The ache before the rain was heavier. The quiet felt deeper. He'd done his usual routine, checked the locks, turned off the lights, stood by the back door for a moment. She was there in her usual spot, a dark loaf of fur. He watched her for a while, her small body rising and falling with each breath. He felt a strange pang of responsibility, of connection, to this small, wild creature who asked for nothing. She was the only living thing that waited for him anymore. He'd finally turned away and headed for the cold comfort of his bed. But sleep wouldn't come. He tossed and turned, the sheets tangling around his legs, the silence pressing in. He kept thinking about her, out there, with the storm about to break. He kept seeing those slow, trusting blinks. Around 2 a.m., he gave up. He swung his legs out of bed, the floorboards cold beneath his feet. He pulled on an old sweatshirt and walked back to the door, expecting to see her huddled and shivering. But the doormat was empty. A cold dread, sharp and irrational, seized him. Of course she was gone. She was astray. She was smart. She'd found better shelter, a dry awning, a warm car engine. It was stupid to feel this sudden, hollow sense of abandonment. She didn't belong to him. She didn't owe him anything. And then he saw it. It wasn't on the mat, but placed carefully just beside it, directly in the center of the concrete slab, where he couldn't possibly miss it when he opened the door in the morning. It was a single feather, but it wasn't just any feather. It wasn't a dull pigeon feather or a dusty sparrow feather. It was long and elegant, a deep, iridescent blue-black, like a sliver of the midnight sky. A crow's feather, maybe, or a raven's. It was perfect, unbroken, and it was laid so deliberately, so precisely that it couldn't have been an accident. It couldn't have just blown there. He stared at it for a long, long time, his hand resting on the cool metal of the doorknob. The world outside was hushed, holding its breath before the downpour. The streetlights cast long, lonely shadows. The cat was nowhere to be seen. But she had been here, and she had left this. His mind raced. Strays bring things. He knew that. Gifts, tokens, dead mice, unfortunate little birds. It was instinct, a way of showing their value, of contributing to the colony. But this felt different. It wasn't a trophy. It felt gentle. It felt like a message. He slowly, quietly unlocked the door. The click of the bolt sounded deafening in the silence. A gust of cool, damp air swirled around his ankles, carrying the scent of rain and wet leaves. He knelt down, his knees cracking, in protest, and reached out a trembling hand. The feather was smooth and cool to the touch. He picked it up, holding it as if it were made of spun glass. He stood there, in the open doorway, the feather resting in his palm. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the concrete, each one a dark, spreading circle. He looked out into the night, into the shadows where she had vanished. She was gone, but she had left a piece of the wild, a piece of the dark, beautiful world right at his door. It was a gift from a creature who had nothing, to a man who felt like he had lost everything. And as the rain began to fall in earnest, washing the city clean, he stood there with the feather in his hand, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the undeniable, terrifying, and hopeful truth of it. Something had begun. You're here listening, and that means more than you know. If you feel safe in these stories, your one subscribe helps me keep this quiet little corner alive. Thank you for being part of this peaceful world. The morning after the feather was different. The silence in the house was still there, a constant pressure against his eardrums. But it had changed its texture. It was no longer a flat, heavy blanket of absence. Now it had a question mark at the end of it, a tiny, curious hook. Elias found himself holding his breath as he rounded the corner into the kitchen, half expecting to see the charcoal gray cat, sitting on the counter as if she belonged there. Of course, she wasn't. The house was as empty as it had been the day before. But on the kitchen windowsill, next to a framed photo of him and Lena laughing on a beach, there was now a single iridescent feather catching the weak morning light. He'd put it in a small empty jam jar. It stood there, stark and beautiful, a piece of the wild night brought into the sterile quiet of his home. It felt important. It felt like evidence. Evidence that he hadn't just dreamed her. Evidence that something had passed between them. A silent acknowledgement across the barrier of glass and grief. That evening, he didn't just wait for her. He prepared. He made himself a cup of tea, the steam warming his cold hands, and he took the feather in its jar and placed it on the small table next to the back door. A little shrine. When the streetlights began to hum and flicker to life, he was already there, sitting in the worn armchair that gave him a clear view of the porch. She arrived just as she always did, a whisper of movement in the twilight, a fluid shadow pouring across the concrete. She settled on the mat, did her little ritual of turning a circle before curling into a perfect dark sphere. But this time, her eyes, glowing faintly in the dusk, were fixed on him. He didn't move. He just sat there, sipping his tea, and they watched each other through the glass. The space between them felt different now. It was no longer just a barrier. It was a medium, a space that held a shared secret. A few days passed in this new rhythm. He would come home from his job at the city archives, a place where he spent his days surrounded by the neatly categorized stories of other people's lives. And a small, hopeful part of him would scan the doormat before he even put his key in. The lock. It was always empty. But every evening, she would return. And every evening, he would sit and watch her, the feather standing vigil on the table between them. Then, one morning, there was another gift. This one was laid in the exact same spot as the feather. It was a single autumn leaf, a maple leaf, so vividly crimson it looked like it was lit from within. It was flawless, without a single tear or brown spot, its edges still sharp. It was as if she had searched the entire neighborhood, scouring the piles of browning, decaying leaves to find this one. Perfect specimen. This single burning ember of a dying season. He picked it up with the same reverence as the feather. The leaf was cool and slightly waxy, delicate in his large, clumsy hands. He took it inside and placed it on the windowsill, right next to the feather. A collection had begun. A language was forming, and he was its sole fumbling student. That night, something shifted in him. The glass door felt like a coward's shield. This small creature was braving the cooling autumn nights for him, leaving him fragments of beauty, and he was hiding inside his warm, quiet house. It didn't feel right. So he pulled on a jacket, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the deadbolt. The click was loud. He opened the door just a crack, slowly, wincing at the faint creak of the hinges. On the mat, the cat's head lifted, her body went rigid. Her ears, those sensitive receivers of information, flattened slightly. She wasn't scared, he realized. She was assessing. He didn't try to step out. He just sat down on the floor, right in the doorway, his legs still inside the house, his back resting against the frame. He left the door open just enough for him to be in her space, but not enough to feel like a threat. The cool night air rushed in, carrying the earthy smell of damp soil and decaying leaves. He could feel the chill seep into his bones, but it was a clean chill, a real feeling. Better than the stale, recycled air of his grief inside. He didn't speak. He didn't look directly at her. He just sat there, breathing in the night. For a long time, she remained tense, a coiled spring of muscle and instinct. He could feel the intensity of her stare on the side of his face. Then, minute by minute, he felt the tension bleed out of her. Her ears relaxed. Her body softened. And with an almost inaudible sigh, she rested her head back on her paws, her gaze shifting from him to the dark street beyond. She had accepted him. This became their new ritual. Every night, he would open the door and sit on the threshold. He was the guardian of the doorway, the liminal space between the lonely safety of his house and the vast, unknown world where she lived. Sometimes he would talk to her, his voice low and raspy from disuse. He told her about his day shelving dusty books. He told her about the weather. He told her about Lena. She would have loved you, he whispered one night, the words tasting strange and rusty in his mouth. She was the one who was good with, well, with everything that was alive. Plants, animals, people. She just understood their language. I never did. The cat blinked slowly at him, a deliberate, calming gesture, as if to say, "You're learning." Do you think they know when we need them most? Do you think animals can sense the hollow spaces inside of us, the parts that have been carved out by loss? He didn't know. He'd never thought much about it before. His life had been so full, so loud, so complete. He'd never needed to look for comfort in the quiet, watchful eyes of a stray. But now, her steadfast presence was a lifeline. She asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and yet she gave him a reason to check the locks at night, a reason to greet the morning, a reason to sit in the cold until his legs went numb. She was giving him a purpose, one tiny, perfect gift at a time. The gifts continued to appear, not every day, but often enough to feel like a conversation. A smooth, gray river stone, a twisted piece of blue twine. Once, a small silver button, cloudy with age, the kind that might have fallen from an old coat. He added each one to the growing collection on the windowsill. The feather, the leaf, the stone, the twine, the button. They were like runes, a scattered alphabet of her world. He would look at them during the day, touching each one, trying to decipher their meaning. They were pieces of a puzzle he didn't understand, but he knew they were important. They were his only connection to the mysterious life she lived when she was away from his door. The nights grew colder. The metallic tang of winter started to creep into the air. The trees shed the last of their fiery leaves, standing like stark, bony skeletons against a bruised purple sky. Elias started leaving, a thick folded blanket on the porch, a few feet from the doormat. She ignored it for a week, preferring the rough familiarity of the mat. He'd watch her, curled up tight against the biting wind, and his heart would ache with a fierce protective instinct he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Then one night, after a particularly harsh wind had rattled the windows all day, he came to the door and found her curled not on the mat, but on the blanket. She had finally accepted his gift of warmth. It was a breakthrough, a concession, a new level of trust he had somehow managed to earn. He started sitting on the top step of the porch, bundled in his thickest coat, a wool hat pulled down over his ears. He was closing the distance, inch by inch, Day by day, she watched him, always, watchful, but she never ran. She held her ground. This was her space, but she was allowing him to be a part of it. One morning, the world was silent in a new way. He looked out the window and saw that the grass, the roof of his car, the entire world was coated in a delicate, shimmering layer of frost. It was the first true frost of the year. The air was sharp and clean in his lungs when he stepped outside. As he walked down the path to get the newspaper, he saw her. She was walking along the edge of the lawn, a small, dark shape in a world of white, and he heard it for the first time. The sound of her paws. A soft, delicate crunch, crunch, crunch on the frozen grass. It was the most fragile, beautiful sound he had ever heard. The sound of life, persisting. That night was the coldest yet. The stars were hard and bright in the black sky, like chips of ice. He put on 2 pairs of socks and his heaviest jacket and went out to their spot. He sat on the bottom step, just a foot or 2 from the blanket where she lay curled. His breath plumed in front of him, a ghostly white cloud. She watched him settle, her green eyes seeming to glow with their own internal light in the deep cold. He sat there for a long time, his body growing numb, his mind quiet. He felt a strange sense of peace. He wasn't waiting for anything. He wasn't hoping for anything. He was just there, with her, sharing the cold, sharing the silence. Slowly, without thinking about it, he extended his hand, palm down, and rested it on the cold concrete step beside his leg. It wasn't an invitation to be petted. It was just an offering, a statement. I am here. I am not a threat. She watched his hand for a long, unblinking moment. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Calculation, consideration. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. The entire world seemed to shrink down to the space between his fingertips and her small, dark face. He could feel the warmth of his own blood, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the air. And then she moved. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was a slow, deliberate unfolding. She lifted her head, uncurled her body, and took one silent, tentative step towards him. Then another. She stopped right before him, her nose twitching as she took in his scent. He could feel the faint warmth radiating from her small body. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a loud, frantic drum in the silent night. He was terrified that he would flinch, that he would make a sound, that he would shatter this fragile, impossible moment. She leaned forward, and for a breathtaking second, he thought she was going to sniff his fingers. But she didn't. She bypassed his hand entirely. She leaned in, right next to his leg, and gently, firmly pressed the side of her face against the rough denim of his jeans. It was just for a moment. A brief, solid pressure against his knee. He felt the surprising roughness of her cheek fur, the solidness of her skull beneath. It was an unmistakable gesture, an anointing, a claim. And then, just as slowly, she pulled back, turned, and settled. Back down on her blanket, tucking her nose under her tail as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened. Elias sat there frozen, his hand still outstretched on the cold concrete. He could still feel the phantom pressure on his knee, a small circle of warmth that was spreading through his entire body, chasing away not just the winter cold, but a deeper, more profound chill that had settled in his soul months ago. She had crossed the space between them. She had touched him. In the vast, silent, indifferent night, this tiny, wild creature had reached out and told him, in the only way she knew how, that he was not alone. The touch had changed things. The brief, solid pressure of her cheek against his knee had been a spark in a dark room, and in its fleeting light, Elias had seen the shape of a new kind of hope. The nights that followed were softer, imbued with a quiet intimacy that felt both precious and terrifyingly fragile. He no longer sat on the steps. a separate entity. He now sat on the folded blanket with her, the one she had claimed as her own. He'd sit at one end and she at the other, a respectable distance between them, but they were sharing the same small island of warmth in the vast, cold ocean of the night. She allowed him to be closer. She would watch him with those luminous, green eyes, and the slow blinks came more frequently now, a silent, rhythmic conversation that he was beginning to understand. It meant, "You are safe." It meant, "I am safe." It meant we are safe, here, together, in this moment. The fear of her vanishing, of this fragile truce ending as suddenly as it began, was a constant low hum beneath the surface of his thoughts, but he pushed it down. He chose to exist in the quiet comfort of their new routine. The gifts continued, but they too felt different, more personal. One evening, after a long, grueling day at the archives, he came home to find a single dried hydrangea head on the mat. It was a pale, dusty blue, its delicate, papery flowers perfectly intact. It was impossibly beautiful. Lena had loved hydrangeas. Their own bush in the corner of the yard had been her pride and joy. He hadn't had the heart to prune it back this year, and it had grown wild and unruly, its blooms browning on the stalk. This one was perfect. It was as if the cat he'd started calling her shadow in the privacy of his own mind had known. He held the brittle flower in his hand and felt a wave of memory so potent it made his knees weak. Lena, her hands covered in dirt, smiling at him from across the yard. The thought didn't just ache anymore. It was still painful, yes, but now it was layered with the impossible, gentle gesture of a stray cat. But then, the pattern began to shift. The mystery began. It started subtly. Winter was tightening its grip on the city, the days short and anemic, the nights long and deeply cold. Shadow's routine had been unwavering. She would appear at dusk and she would be gone by dawn. He never saw her leave. He would just wake up, and the blanket on the porch would be empty, holding only the faint impression of her small body, a ghost of warmth against the freezing air. But one evening, she was late. Not by minutes, but by over an hour. Elias found himself pacing the kitchen, his heart a cold knot of anxiety. He kept peering out the back door, scanning the deep shadows, his breath fogging the glass. It was ridiculous. She was a wild animal. She had a life he knew nothing about. She didn't operate on his schedule, but their routine had become such a fixed point in his unmoored life that her absence felt like a betrayal, a breaking of a sacred pact. When she finally appeared, a flicker of darkness at the edge of the porch light, relief washed over him so intensely he felt dizzy. But as she padded towards the blanket, he saw that something was different. There was a small, fresh scratch on her nose, a thin red line against her dark fur. And her movements, usually so fluid and precise, seemed tired, weighed down. She settled on the blanket and looked at him, and he saw a weariness in her eyes he'd never seen before. That night, she didn't leave a gift. The next morning, however, there was something new, and it wasn't from nature. Lying in the center of the doormat was a small, red woolen mitten. It was a child's mitten, knitted with a faded, slightly lopsided snowman stitched on the back. It was damp from the frost, and it smelled faintly of wood smoke and wet wool. Elias picked it up. The texture was soft, but worn, loved. He turned it over and over in his hands, his mind racing. Where had she gotten this? The feather, the leaf, the stone. Those were things of her world, the wild world. But this was from his, a small, lost piece of a human life. He imagined a child, crying on the way home from school. One hand, cold and bare. The thought brought a pang of sadness. He looked at Shadow, who had returned that evening and was now watching him from her end of the blanket. "Where did you find this?" he whispered, holding it out. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable, and then gave one of her long, slow blinks. There was no answer in her eyes, only a deep, quiet knowing he couldn't penetrate. This was the beginning of the change. Her disappearances became more common. Sometimes she would vanish for hours in the middle of the night. He'd wake up at 3 a.m. to a silence that felt empty again, and he'd find the blanket cold. She would always return before dawn, looking, a little more tired, a little more scuffed than before. And she would bring gifts. But they were all like the mitten, lost things, human things. A week later, it was a piece of faded blue velvet ribbon, slightly frayed at the ends. The kind a little girl might wear in her hair. It was laid out on the mat, a straight, careful line against the gray fibers. Elias added it to the windowsill collection, which was starting to look like the contents of a junk drawer, a bizarre assembly of nature's perfection and humanity's cast-offs, the beautiful and the abandoned. Then came a single, small, silver earring, the clasp broken. It was cheap, the kind of thing you'd buy from a street vendor, a little star with a missing fleck of rhinestone. He held it in his palm, the cold metal pressing into his skin. Who had worn this? Who had lost it? Each object was a tiny, silent story, a story that Shadow was bringing to his doorstep. But why? Was she trying to build a bridge between her world and his, using these found objects as the materials? Or was it something else? The worry started to eat at him. It was a living thing, growing in the dark, quiet hours of the night. He would lie in bed and imagine her out there, in the frozen city. Was she navigating dangerous alleys, crossing busy streets? Was the scratch on her nose from a fight with another cat, or something worse? The thought of losing her, of coming to the door one evening and finding it empty, and for it to remain empty night after night, that thought was unbearable. He was becoming attached, and his attachment made him vulnerable. He was opening his heart again, just a crack, and he was terrified it would be broken. Have you ever loved something you knew you couldn't completely protect? A child learning to ride a bike, a friend making a bad decision, a small wild creature who slips away into the darkness every night. It's a helpless kind of love, a terrifying kind. You want to wrap them in bubble wrap, to lock them away from every possible danger, but you can't. Their life is their own, and you can only stand on the sidelines and watch and worry. His worry spurred him to action. One Saturday, he put on his coat and decided to walk. He tucked the red mitten into his pocket, the worn wool a strange comfort in his hand. He walked the streets of his neighborhood, really looking at them for the first time in months. He'd been living in a fog, moving from his car to his house to his office, the world outside just a blur through a window. Now he saw the details, the peeling paint on a neighbor's fence, the lonely snowman in a front yard, its stick arms reaching for nothing. He looked for a little girl with one red mitten. He scanned front porches for a velvet ribbon. He felt like a fool, a madman on a secret, nonsensical quest. He found nothing. The city kept its secrets. The lost things remained lost, their owners anonymous and absent. The first snow fell. It came down thick and silent in the night, blanketing the world in a pristine, muffling layer of white. The city sounds were hushed. The porch light cast a soft, golden glow on the accumulating drifts. Shadow appeared through the swirling flakes like a spirit, her dark fur a stark contrast to the snow. She shook the powder from her coat and settled on her blanket, which he had dutifully cleared. He went out to join her, the crunch of his boots the only sound in the world. The cold was absolute. He sat beside her, and the warmth from his own, Body felt like a pitiful defense against the vast, indifferent winter. She seemed unbothered. She was a creature of this world, of the cold and the dark. That night, she disappeared around midnight. Elias stayed by the door, watching the snow fall, watching for her return. He saw her tracks leading away from the porch, a perfect, delicate trail of paw prints heading off into the darkness, towards the back alley. He had a sudden, overwhelming urge to follow them, to uncover her secret, but he resisted. It felt like a violation of the trust they had built. So he just waited. When she came back, hours later, she looked exhausted. Her paws were caked with snow and mud. And on the doormat, she left the most curious gift yet, a single, slightly rusty key. It was an old-fashioned skeleton key, ornate and heavy. It wasn't a key to any modern lock, he knew. It was a key to a story, a key to a past he couldn't access. He picked it up, the cold metal biting at his fingertips. This was different. This felt like a turning point. A mitten was a mistake. A ribbon could fall. But a key is meant to open something. It was a deliberate object. A tool. The next night, the routine broke. The snow had stopped, leaving the world frozen and still. The temperature had plummeted. It was the kind of cold that felt dangerous. Elias had put out fresh water for her in a heated bowl he'd bought online, an extravagant purchase that he didn't even question. He waited for her at dusk, and he waited. The hours ticked by. 7 o'clock, 8, 9. The house was colder and quieter than ever before. He didn't bother making dinner. He just sat in the armchair, his eyes fixed on the empty, snow-covered patio. The anxiety was a physical thing now, a tightening in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He kept telling himself she was fine. She was smart. She'd found a warmer place to ride out the deep freeze, a garage, a basement, a warm engine block. It was better for her, safer. But his heart didn't believe it. Their bond, their nightly ritual, had been broken by the cold. He felt a familiar, crushing wave of loss. Of course. Everything he cared about eventually left. By midnight, he had given up hope. He stood up, his joints stiff, and walked to the door to draw the curtains, to block out the sight of the empty blanket. The empty space where she was supposed to be. His hand was on the cord when he saw it. A flicker of movement at the far edge of the yard. It was her. Shadow. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, his knees weak with relief, but she wasn't coming towards the house. She was standing by the back fence, half hidden by the snow-laden branches of the old lilac bush. And she was wrong. She was hunched over, her fur puffed out, not just against the cold, but in a way that seemed distressed. He watched, his heart pounding, as she took a few unsteady steps towards the house. She looked utterly spent, as if she had traveled a great distance. She reached the edge of the patio into the circle of the porch light and stopped. She didn't go to the blanket. She didn't look for food or water. She just stood there in the snow, trembling slightly, and looked directly at him, through the glass. And then she did something she had never, ever done before. She opened her mouth, and a small, hoarse, desperate sound came out. Mew. It wasn't. A cry for food. It wasn't a greeting. It was a plea. It was a sound filled with a terrible, urgent weight. Her eyes, wide and luminous, held his. And then, slowly, deliberately, she turned her head and looked back into the darkness from which she had come. She held the pose for a long moment, a silent, desperate pointer, before turning back to him, her gaze unwavering. She hadn't brought him a gift tonight. She had brought him an invitation, a summons, and the message was terrifyingly clear. Follow me. Time seemed to freeze in the space between her desperate cry and his next breath. That single, fragile sound, the first he had ever heard her make, shattered the frozen silence of the night and went straight through the thick, insulating layers of his grief. It was a sound that didn't ask, but demanded, a sound that spoke of things far beyond a simple need for food or shelter. It was the sound of a world pushed to its absolute limit. Elias's hand, still resting on the curtain cord, fell to his side. His mind, which had been a fog of numb resignation just moments before, was suddenly shockingly clear. The warmth and safety of his quiet house felt like a cage. The silence he had cultivated as a shield now felt like a form of cowardice. For weeks, this small, wild creature had been an anchor for him, a quiet companion in his loneliness. He had taken the comfort she offered, accepted her strange, beautiful gifts, and believed this fragile relationship was on his terms, separated by a pane of glass and the vast gulf of their different worlds. He had been wrong, terribly wrong. This was not on his terms. It had never been. She hadn't just appeared in his life. She had chosen him. She had waited. She had tested him. And now, the test was over. The question was no longer what she wanted from him, but what he was willing to do for her. He didn't think. He acted. A deep, primal instinct took over, bypassing the part of his brain that calculated risk and nursed sorrow. He turned from the door and moved through his dark, silent house with a purpose he hadn't felt in nearly a year. His feet found their way to the hall closet. He pulled on his heavy winter boots, his fingers clumsy as he fumbled with the laces. He grabbed the thickest, warmest coat he owned, the one he and Lena had bought for a hiking trip in the mountains they never took. He shoved a pair of gloves into his pocket and, as an afterthought, snatched a powerful LED flashlight from the utility drawer in the kitchen. As he walked back to the door, his heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Fear was there. A cold, coiling thing in his gut. Fear of the unknown, of the dark, of what he might find. But beneath the fear was something stronger, a fierce, surging wave of responsibility. He would not fail her. He could not. He opened the door. The Arctic air was a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. Shadow was still there, a small, dark statue in the snow, waiting. The moment the door opened, her head snapped towards him, her eyes wide and bright in the porch light. She didn't run. She didn't flinch. She simply held his gaze, and in that look, an entire unspoken volume passed between them. You came. He stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the profound stillness. He was in her world now. She gave a small, sharp nod, as if to say, "It's time," and turned. She didn't run. She moved at a steady, deliberate pace, a determined plod through the deep snow, glancing over her shoulder every few feet to make sure. He was following. He followed. He crunched after her, his boots sinking deep into the powder. The flashlight beam cut a clean, white tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust of tiny ice crystals in the air. They left the small, safe circle of his property and plunged into the back alley that ran behind the houses. This was a secret geography he never saw, a world of overflowing dumpsters, frozen puddles, and skeletal fire escapes. She navigated it with an unnerving confidence, her small body a smudge of black against the snow-dusted brickwork. The cold was brutal. It snaked into the gaps in his clothing, biting at his exposed skin. His breath came in ragged white plumes. The city, his city, felt alien and menacing at this hour, under its shroud of snow and silence. The familiar shapes of houses were transformed into dark, looming monoliths. But he didn't feel lost. Shadow was his guide. Her small, determined form, always just at the edge of his flashlight beam, was a beacon. She was leading him somewhere specific, and with every step, the feeling grew stronger that he was walking towards the answer to everything. The feather, the leaf, the mitten, the key. All the pieces of the puzzle she had so carefully laid at. his door. They walked for what felt like an eternity, though it was likely only 10 minutes. She led him away from the residential streets, towards a derelict area bordering an old, abandoned railway line. They squeezed through a gap in a chain link fence, the rusty metal snagging on his coat. Here, the snow was mostly untouched, a vast white blanket covering a forgotten world of weeds and rubble. And at the back of the lot, almost completely consumed by a wild tangle of dead ivy and skeletal trees, stood the ruin of an old greenhouse. Most of its glass panes were shattered, jagged teeth smiling at the hard, starry sky. Snow lay in a thick mantle on its sagging roof. It was a place of decay, a place where things that once lived had been left to die. It looked like the saddest, most forgotten place in the world. Shadow stopped at a broken doorway, the frame hanging off one hinge, and looked back at him. This was it. This was the place. Elias's heart was in his throat. He took a deep breath, the freezing air searing his lungs, and stepped through the doorway into the deeper darkness within. Inside, the air was still and smelled of frozen earth, rotting wood, and something else, something faintly musky and alive. The flashlight beam sliced through the gloom, revealing rows of overturned pots, shattered bags of soil, and the gnarled, dead remains of ancient plants. Snow had drifted in through the broken roof, creating pale, ghostly dunes on the dirt floor. Shadow didn't hesitate. She padded silently to the far corner of the greenhouse, to a dark space underneath a long, rotting potting bench. She disappeared beneath it, and for a terrifying second, he was alone. Then her small face reappeared, and she let out another of those soft, urgent mews. A summons. His hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the flashlight steady. He knelt down, the frozen ground biting into his knees, and aimed the beam of light into the space she had indicated. At first, he saw nothing but shadows and debris. Then, he saw a shape. An old wooden crate turned on its side, creating a small, sheltered cavern. And inside the crate, something was moving. He crawled closer, his breath held tight in his chest. He angled the light just so, and he saw it, the source of the mystery. The reason for her exhaustion, the secret she had been carrying. It was a nest, a makeshift, desperate, beautiful nest. And curled together in the center, a tiny, writhing pile of life, were 3 kittens. They were so small, their eyes barely open, their fur a mottled mix of gray and black. They were mewling softly, impossibly small sounds, as they blindly nudged against each other for warmth. Elias felt the air leave his body in a single, silent rush. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. His entire world narrowed to the sight of those 3 tiny, vulnerable creatures, fighting for life in the heart of a frozen, dead place. And then his eyes adjusted, and he saw what the nest was made of. He saw the soft gray down of pigeon feathers. He saw dried leaves and scraps of what looked like old newspaper. He saw a length of faded blue velvet ribbon, woven through the tatters of an old blanket. He saw a single broken silver earring, glinting dully in the light. And nestled right in the center, tucked against the smallest of the kittens, was a small, red woolen mitten with a lopsided snowman on the back. The truth crashed down on him. Not like a wave, but like a building collapsing. It buckled his knees and stole the air from his lungs. The gifts. They had never been for him. He had been so lost in his own lonely world, so wrapped up in the narrative of a man finding solace with, astray, that he had made the whole story about himself. He'd thought she was bringing him presents, speaking a language of gratitude he could understand. But she wasn't bringing him gifts. She was bringing him evidence. She was bringing him pieces of her desperate, secret project. She wasn't saying, "Thank you." She was saying, Look what I'm trying to do. Look how hard this is. Look what I'm building, all alone, in the cold. She was a mother, a fierce, terrified, and utterly exhausted mother, trying to keep her babies alive in the face of an impossible winter, the scratch on her nose, the weariness in her eyes, her long disappearances into the night. It had all been for them. Every ounce of her energy, every risk she took, was for them. He dropped his head into his hands, the flashlight falling into the snow beside him, its beam pointing uselessly at the ceiling. A sob, raw and violent, tore its way out of his chest. It was a sound he hadn't made since the day Lena died. He knelt there, in the dirt and the snow, in the ruins of a forgotten greenhouse, and wept. He cried for the kittens, so small and fragile. He cried for Shadow, for her impossible strength and her silent, desperate plea. And he cried for himself, for his blindness, for his self-pity. He cried for the 8 months he had spent locked inside his own grief, while life, fierce and stubborn and beautiful, had been fighting to exist just beyond his back door. He cried for Lena, who would have understood all of this in an instant, who would have known exactly what to do. He was shaking, gasping for air, lost in a storm of grief and shame, and a strange, overwhelming awe. And in the depths of his breakdown, he felt a faint warmth against his hand. He lifted his tear-streaked face. Shadow had left her kittens. She had crossed the small distance between her nest and his broken form, and she was standing beside him. She looked up at him, her green eyes clear and deep and full of a knowledge that felt ancient. And then, slowly, deliberately, she leaned in and pressed her head firmly into his trembling open palm. It was not the tentative brush against his knee. This was different. This was a transfer of weight, a surrender, a profound and unmistakable gesture of absolute trust. Her fur was soft against his skin, her small, solid skull a grounding presence in his swirling chaos. She wasn't asking anymore. She was accepting. She was telling him that she had chosen right. He looked from her eyes to the nest of kittens, then back to her. The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place, the final, rusty key she had brought him. She wasn't just showing him her nest. She was giving him the key. He finally understood what she had been trying to tell him all along. It wasn't just look. It was help. He had been waiting for a sign, for a purpose, for a reason to step back into the world of the living. And here it was. It was small and furry and mewling in a cardboard box in the heart of a frozen winter. The cold in the abandoned greenhouse was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to suck the very warmth from his blood. But kneeling there on the frozen earth, with a weeping that felt like it was cracking open his ribs, Elias felt a fire ignite in his core. It was the fierce, brilliant heat of purpose. The storm of his grief had finally broken, and in the aftermath, the landscape of his world was irrevocably changed. The path forward was no longer a long, gray, featureless road. It was a single illuminated point. Them. He wiped his tears away with the back of a frozen glove, his breath coming in shuddering gasps. Shadow was still there, her head pressed into his hand, a silent, steady anchor. He looked at her, and then at the shivering pile of new life in the crate. There was no question, not anymore. He was not leaving them here, not for one more minute. Slowly, carefully, he got to his feet, his knees aching from the cold. "Okay," he whispered, his voice a raw croak. "Okay, we're going home, all of us." The logistics of the rescue were a frantic, clumsy ballet of desperation and care. The crate was too old and rotten to move. He looked around the derelict greenhouse, and his eyes landed on a sturdy, shallow cardboard box that had once held bags of fertilizer. It was empty and dry. He cleared it of dust and debris. Then, moving with a reverence he hadn't felt since he'd packed away Lena's clothes, He began to transfer the nest. He lifted the entire makeshift bed, the scraps of blanket, the leaves, the ribbon, and the little red mitten, and placed it gently inside the box. The whole time, Shadow watched him, her green eyes tracking his every move. There was no fear in her gaze, no aggression, only a deep, unnerving stillness. She was trusting him with everything she had in the world. The hardest part was moving the kittens. He took off his thick outer gloves, his fingers instantly numb in the frigid air. One by one, he lifted them. They were impossibly light, their tiny bodies squirming, their mews thin and reedy. He cupped each one in his hands, breathing his warm breath over them before placing them carefully into the nest he had prepared. Shadow stood by the box, her nose twitching, her tail giving a single, anxious flick. But she didn't interfere. She let him do it. She let him help. Once all three were settled, he took off his own coat, the warm coat he had barely used, and draped it over the top of the box, leaving a small gap for air. It was the best he could do to shield them from the brutal cold of the journey home. He lifted the box. It was so light, yet it felt like the heaviest, most precious thing he had ever carried. "Okay," he said softly to Shadow. "Lead the way." The journey back was a torment of focused anxiety. Every step was a calculation. He avoided icy patches. He moved slowly to keep the box from jostling, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Shadow walked beside him now, no longer a guide in the distance, but a close escort, her dark form a constant, reassuring presence at his heels. They were a strange, silent procession moving through the sleeping, snow-covered city. A man who had lost his family, and a cat who was fighting to keep hers, bound together on a desperate pilgrimage back to the warmth. The moment he stepped back inside his own house, the wave of warm, still air felt like a benediction. He carefully placed the box on the floor in the center of the living room, a room he had barely used for months. It had been a showroom of memories, a place to be avoided. Now it was a nursery, a sanctuary. He flicked on a lamp, and the soft light filled the space. He removed his coat from the box. The kittens were huddled together, mewling in confusion. Shadow immediately jumped into the box, her body arching over them, and she began to lick them furiously, her rough tongue cleaning and comforting them. A low, rumbling purr started in her chest, a sound so deep and resonant it seemed to make the very air in the room vibrate. It was the sound of a crisis past, the sound of safety. The hours that followed were a blur. Elias moved with a frenetic energy he didn't know he possessed. He cranked up the thermostat. He found an old heating pad and set it on low, wrapping it in a towel and tucking it under one side of their nesting box. He drove to a 24-hour supermarket, his mind racing under the harsh fluorescent lights. He bought kitten milk replacer, tiny bottles, soft blankets, and cans of the most expensive, nutrient-rich cat food he could find. He had no idea what he was doing, but he was doing something. He was acting. He was fighting for life, and in doing so, fighting for his own. The days melted into a new kind of rhythm. The oppressive silence of the house was gone forever, replaced by the gentle symphony of new life, the soft mews of hungry kittens, the deep, steady thrum of their mothers' purr, the quiet click of Elias's footsteps as he checked on them in the middle of the night. His house was no longer a museum of grief. It was a hospital. It was a home. Shadow, the wild, untouchable stray, transformed before his eyes. She was a devoted, tireless mother, but she was also his partner. She would look at him across the living room, her eyes meeting his, and give him a slow, deliberate blink that was no longer just about trust. It was about gratitude. It was about a shared victory. She allowed him into her world completely. He would sit by the box, and she would knead the blankets beside him, her head sometimes resting against his arm. she still retained a core of wildness. Sometimes, she would sit at the back door and stare out at the night, a silent acknowledgement of the world she came from. But she always came back to the warmth of the living room, to her family. To him, he was healing. He didn't realize it was happening, not at first. But the change was as gradual and undeniable as the kitten's growth. He woke up one morning and realized the first thing he thought of wasn't the empty space beside him in bed, but whether the kitten's water dish was clean. He found himself humming as he prepared their food. He was so focused on them, on their survival and their needs, that he had less time to dwell in the cavern of his own loss. The grief was still there, a foundational part of him, but it was no longer the only thing. It was as if the grief was a vast, quiet room in his heart, and he had spent months sitting alone in the dark. Now, someone had come in and opened a window, letting in a sliver of light and the sounds of the world outside. The kittens grew. Their eyes opened, revealing 3 pairs of cloudy blue-green orbs. They took their first clumsy, stumbling steps. Their personalities began to emerge. There was a bold little gray tabby he called Boulder, a sleek, all-black one, just like his mother, that he named, of course, Shadowfax, or Fax for short. And there was the smallest one, a little calico girl with a patch of orange over one eye, who was quieter and more observant than the others. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after that frozen night in the greenhouse, Elias was sitting on the floor, watching them play. They were a chaotic tumble of tiny paws and sharp little teeth, wrestling with a crumpled piece of paper. The sun was streaming through the window, a pale, watery late-winter light. For the first time, he noticed that the windowsill was dusty. He'd been so busy, he hadn't cleaned. His small collection of gifts, the stone, the twine, the button, the key, sat there, gathering a thin film of dust next to Lena's photograph. He smiled. He stood up and walked over, picking up the picture. He looked at Lena's laughing face. "You wouldn't believe it," he whispered, his voice thick. "The house is a mess. It smells like, well, it smells like cats. There are 3 of them. They're tiny terrors. But you would have loved them. You would have known just what to do." He wasn't talking to a memory anymore. He was talking to a presence. He was sharing his life with her, the life that had continued impossibly after hers had ended. He placed the photo back on the sill, his fingers brushing against the first gift, the raven feather, still perfect, still iridescent, standing in its little glass jar. He went back to sitting on the floor. The quiet little calico, the one he hadn't named yet, had tired of the game. She was batting at something near the windowsill. With a surprising leap, she managed to hook a claw into the jam jar, toppling it over. The feather slid out onto the floor. She pounced on it, tossing it in the air. Elias watched, a soft smile on his face. She was so gentle with it, as if she understood it was important. She batted it a few times, nudging it across the wood floor, closer and closer to him. And then she picked it up carefully in her tiny mouth, trotted the last few feet over to him, and dropped it right in his lap. She looked up at him, her head cocked, and let out a soft, questioning mew. The world stopped. He looked down at the feather resting on his jeans. The very first gift. The one that had started it all. The one he had so profoundly misunderstood. He had seen it as a message of gratitude from a lonely stray. Then he had learned it was a piece of a desperate nest, a cry for help. But now it was something else entirely. It had been taken from the collection of his past, from the monument to his grief, by the new life that had filled his home. And it had been brought to him, freely and with intention. A gift with no desperation. A gift of pure, simple connection. The circle was complete. The story had been rewritten one last time. He reached down and stroked the little calico's head. He finally had a name for her. "Hope," he whispered. He looked around the room. At the kittens playing, at Shadow, sleeping peacefully on the armchair, her wild vigil finally over. At the sunlight painting patterns on the floor. His house was no longer empty. His heart was no longer silent. He had learned love's most difficult and beautiful lesson. It's not about holding on to what you've lost. It's about making space for what might be found. Grief is not a room to lock yourself inside of. It's a foundation upon which you can, piece by broken piece, build a new home. He didn't just save a cat and her kittens. They, in their infinite silent wisdom, had saved him. They were the final greatest gift. You stayed till the end. Thank you. If it felt like a soft hug or a warm purr in your heart, subscribing lets me bring you more moments like this.